So far, so good. Well, hello, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here today. Obviously, I wish we could be together in person. That isn't possible quite yet, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to do something like this all in the same room. So I've been at Janssen for a little less than 4 years. Prior to that, I spent my career in the government. I was at FDA and before that at BARDA. I'm currently in our regulatory policy group, which is within regulatory affairs, and my portfolio is pretty broad, but for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm the US lead for RWE Regulatory Policy. So I help our product teams understand how FDA is thinking about real-world evidence, and I provide analysis regarding some of the public feedback FDA has shared on submissions that use real-world evidence. And I also do a lot of external advocacy work. I co-lead the Bio RWE Task Force, where we think about specific issues within real-world evidence that we want to make progress on and how best to achieve those and what kinds of deliverables to focus on. So for today, I want to provide some background and context for the other issues and topics that you're going to be hearing about throughout the webinar. So we'll start with some of the legislative and regulatory mandates in real-world evidence. So first, definitions. I don't know, everybody on this webinar today, you may have different backgrounds. So just to ground us, when we look at the FDA RWE framework, these are the definitions that they use, and we'll be talking about the framework in a minute. So real-world data is data relating to patient health status and the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And real-world evidence is clinical evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of real-world data. Or as we like to think about it, real-world data plus analytics equals real-world evidence. So how did we get to the current place where real-world evidence has become such an in vogue term and there's so much interest? Well, it really started about 10 plus years ago with the HITECH Act. So in 2009, President Obama signed legislation that included the HITECH Act. This is all part of the economic stimulus to address the 2008 financial crisis. And HITECH did a number of things, but included $35 billion for incentives to promote the use and the development and use of EHRs. So it's really, we can point to HITECH in terms of spurring a significant growth in the availability of electronic health data, or what we also call real-world data. Oops. All right. Okay. So with HITECH, there was starting to be a lot of use of real-world evidence for clinical care, but not surprisingly, people started thinking about using this information from real-world evidence in other ways besides just clinical care. So thinking about how could it be used for regulatory decisions? How could it support research and understanding of product safety and product effectiveness? So in the 2016-2017 timeframe, you saw some of these ideas codified in legislation. And both PHUSE 6, which is the user fee agreement that describes the timelines for drug reviews, as well as the fees that that sponsors pay when they issue a submission to FDA, as well as 21st Century Cures. These are signed around the same time, and they both included provisions for real-world evidence. So there's a troika of activities and deliverables. The take home here is that they're fairly similar between PDUFA 6 and and 21st Century Cures. We start with workshops and pilot opportunities, program. So that's basically different pilots that FDA is doing. And all of this culminates in draft guidance, which we will see at the end of 2021. So that's still a ways off. There's a lot happening before we get to that guidance, and that's some of what I'll be telling you about today. So as part of this flurry of activities mandated under 21st Century Cures and PDUFA 6, FDA issued the RWE framework in December of 2018. We have to remember that a lot of what is new here is really the focus on product effectiveness with real-world evidence. There's a very well-charted history in terms of using real-world evidence and pharmacoepidemiological principles to study real-world evidence for safety purposes. So when FDA issued this framework, it was really the first major document stemming from FDA that was not a journal perspective to start to outline FDA's thinking about real-world evidence more broadly. And the focus areas of this framework were actually prescribed within the various pieces of legislation. And what those said is that the framework needed to focus on sources of real-world evidence, gaps in data collection activities, standard methodologies for collection and analyses of real-world evidence, and then priority areas, remaining challenges, and potential pilot opportunities. So FDA's real-world evidence is multifaceted. It includes demonstration projects, some of which you're going to hear about today, stakeholder engagement, and internal processes to bring senior leadership input into the evaluation of real-world evidence. So FDA has what's called the RWE subcommittee, which is led by CDER, but includes members of both CDRH and CBER. So it's a very broad set of stakeholders who are involved in this working group to make sure that there is broad visibility and dialogue on both policy and technical issues across the agency. So one of the most, I think, important pieces of the FDA's RWE framework document is this section that talks about the criteria that will be used to evaluate supplemental indications for label changes. And these could be things about effectiveness, a change in dose or the dose regimen, the route of administration, adding a new population. It's pretty varied. But the three criteria are whether or not RWE are fit for use. So this gets to the quality of the RW data and evidence in terms of whether or not things like, is the data actually representative of the population you want to study? Are you getting the outcomes that are important to do the analyses that you need to do? Temporal issues about the data, all sorts of quality issues. The second one is whether or not the evidence can then provide adequate scientific evidence to answer a regulatory question. And what this is really getting at is, can you establish, if you're looking at an effectiveness decision, can you in fact establish some kind of causal inference? That has turned out to be challenging. We've seen in a number of submissions to date that there are numerous difficulties with bias and confounding to, in fact, ensure that you are able to provide adequate scientific evidence. And then the third area is whether or not the study conduct meets FDA regulatory requirements. So these are really the statutory requirements around study monitoring and data collection. So the last part I want to leave you with about the FDA RWE framework is that you may remember a couple slides ago I said that there was going to be a guidance that will culminate in 2021, and we don't know exactly the focus of that guidance. That was not specified in the legislation. But what the FDA RWE framework did is it actually listed 7 action items, so these 5 here and 2 on the next page, about more specific topics where the FDA acknowledges that guidance is needed. And so all of these action items from the FDA RWE framework are areas where they either say they're going to commit to writing to guidance, or they will consider writing guidance based on feedback that they get. So these topics include things like the reliability and relevance of real-world data, gaps in real-world data sources, a guidance on pragmatic design elements or pragmatic trials, which we're not really going to get into today. External control arms. There have already been many attempts to use external control arms in regulatory submissions, so that's certainly a ripe area for guidance. Observational study designs using real-world data. And then guidance on use of electronic source data. And then finalizing a guidance on electronic records and signatures in clinical investigations under 21 CFR Part 11. So FDA, what this tells us is that FDA is very cognizant that each of these issues, and probably many others, are areas where both industry and FDA are still working their way through some of these issues and challenges, and putting together solutions and opportunities to leverage some of these real-world data sources. Okay, so I'm going to shift now into RWE tools and pilots. I'm only going to mention a couple of you just today, just to give you a flavor of these. So the first one that I want to mention is the FDA My Studies app. This is an app that was developed by FDA and piloted by FDA with Kaiser of Washington State. And it is an app that has has a storage environment. It's been used with Sentinel and PCORnet. It's specifically designed to collect patient-reported data in a clinical study and store them in a central location. One thing to note is it is standalone, so it doesn't link a priori to other systems, other EHRs or claim systems. But it has the ability, if you want to do that linking, to provide that, and that's something they did in the pilot study. One of the reasons I raised this today, there are certainly many apps out there that collect patient data, but FDA developed this in mind so that it could be compliant with 21 CFR Part 11 and be used for trials under IND oversight. So that's obviously a big advantage if you're thinking about using an app that can collect real-world data as part of your trial, and something that you want to be able to submit to the agency. So in terms of how, what this app can do and how it fits in with other tools that are available, it can collect direct patient input. It's a very patient-centered app, and it can collect, it's sort of the link between EHRs and claims data. So EHRs, of course, capture what's happening in a clinical setting during a clinical visit, and claims capture, what was paid for. But there's obviously a lot of medical events that happen outside of the interaction with the healthcare system that can be captured as well. We know that one of the biggest issues in terms of how medical products work has to do with medication adherence. So an app can capture something around medication adherence. Non-medically attended outcomes. So these are things that happen that affect the well-being of a patient, but may not require them coming in to see a healthcare provider. They can be things like illicit drug use or tobacco use, supplement use, socioeconomic indicators, OTC, over-the-counter drug use, and other information. So there's obviously a lot that happens outside the clinical setting that impacts how patients are doing. And then the other key thing that can be captured is functional status scales, which again usually need to be captured multiple times over a period of time to get useful data. And all of this can be used and embedded with more traditional types of real-world evidence studies, so traditional clinical trials like RCTs, pragmatic trials, observational studies, and registries. So it really has the capability to expand both the type and the volume of data that we typically collect. Okay, the second project I want to talk about is really geared towards understanding how RWE compares to RCTs in terms of the types of results that are available. So this is Project Duplicate. It is an RCT replication project using real-world evidence. It's a collaboration between FDA, Aetion, which is a data analytics platform company, and Harvard Brigham Women's Hospital, which is leading this effort. And I like to say that there are two flavors of replication studies. There's post-replication. This is replicating the findings of a completed RCT using RWE data sources. And the plan is to replicate about 30 completed studies. They chose areas where they knew that the outcomes would be pretty well available in real-world data sources. So cardiovascular, endocrinology, musculoskeletal, and pulmonary. Interestingly, they're going to look at 23 studies that led to FDA approvals, as well as 7 studies that did not lead to FDA approval. So that's another area of distinction that they hope to tease out doing this replication work. The second flavor is pre-replication. So this is replicating an RCT that has started, so you don't know the results yet. And then you do go ahead and do the replication using real-world evidence. And then after you have the RCT results, you can compare the two. And there are 7 ongoing phase 4 trials, which will be part of that study. So these are probably more geared towards safety. So the learning objectives are really to understand, which methods perform better in real data and real clinical questions, and which answers can be answered with non-randomized RWE. So we have to remember that a key feature of many RWE studies is that they're retrospective and that there isn't randomization. So what are a couple of issues for us to be aware of as we start to see the results this year? And the last we had heard, the results were going to be available by the end of this year. Obviously, with everything going on, timelines are a bit of a moving target. But we have to remember the distinction between efficacy and effectiveness. So clinical trials measure efficacy, real-world data studies measures effectiveness. These are nuanced but definitely different concepts. And when we're doing this, the question then becomes, well, what constitutes agreement between real-world evidence and an RCT study? That is an ongoing debate, and we'll see what the results look like if they help us answer this any better. And then just more generally, how does the role of real-world adherence, and again, I talked about this in a previous slide, this issue of medication adherence in the real world and how it can be so variable and so different from what happens in a clinical trial, may also impact effectiveness findings, and that's just something we don't understand very well right now. So because I'm a policy person, I would be remiss if I didn't spend a little bit of time talking about real-world evidence regulatory activities that are happening externally. So a lot of these are kind of consortia type activities that bring together a broad range of stakeholders, and many institutions have been leading the way in some of these really thorny and very interesting discussions. So obviously FDA, but you have groups like the National Academies, Friends of Cancer Research. I'm going to talk a little bit about a really interesting area of work that Friends of Cancer Research has been leading in a minute. MRCT at Harvard, the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy has convened a number of workshops and published a number of papers. I would direct you there if you're interested in doing some more reading about real-world evidence issues. ISPOR, which has been doing a lot of work to look at transparency around real-world evidence, CTTI, Odyssey, which is a platform for developing a common data model. All of these groups, and I'm sure I've missed quite a few. This is by no means complete. And so what are the kinds of issues and topics that groups are grappling with right now? Well, I alluded to this earlier, so data quality. When is RWD fit for purpose? And how do you, what processes do you use to demonstrate that the real world data is of sufficient regulatory grade quality? Sources of bias and confounding and analytic methods to reduce them. This is, I would say, a really interesting but very challenging area. There are just a lot of ways that bias and confounding can creep into real-world evidence, and there are a lot of good analytic methods available to reduce some of this, but there's also what's called unknown bias and confounding, and that is harder to address. The use of RWE synthetic control arms has gotten a lot of interest lately, especially in the oncology field. Real-world evidence endpoints, validating endpoints, defining key parameters, and then transparency and data dredging. So one principle that's very important is to pre-specify what you're doing when you're conducting a real-world evidence study for regulatory purposes. And that raises a whole slew of questions about, well, what do you have to show publicly before you conduct your study? What's required for requiring? It's not like the clinical trials paradigm where everything goes on clinicaltrials.gov. Data standards, so that's really around the types of formatting to make sure that there's harmonization across different groups who are using real-world data. And then demonstrating that RWE can help fulfill the substantial evidence requirements for causal inference. This is obviously critically important for any for regulatory decision. And then finally, there are many demonstration projects going on right now that all are going to be quite valuable, enhancing our understanding of what we can do with real-world evidence, and probably just as importantly, thinking about what do we also need to do upstream to enhance the learning healthcare system so that we have the right data available to do these really robust studies. Okay, so I wanted to mention some really targeted work that Friends of Cancer Research is doing in the endpoint arena, and this is in non-small cell lung cancer. So this has been an ongoing effort, and they started in 2018 convening different data partners together. So they started with 4 data partners, and the question they essentially put forward to everyone is, tell us what your results look like for real-world overall survival, and let's see, you know, is there agreement or disagreement? How much alignment is there or not? But every partner had their own definition of real-world overall survival, other endpoints and definitions therein. So we don't really know how well, it wasn't exactly an apples to apples comparison is the best way to think of it. So Friends decided to advance this further this past year, and they added 6 new data partners, so they had 10 in total. And this time they had everybody roll up their sleeves and said, let's do some front-end work to try to align some of these key definitions before we do any of these comparisons, and then see, you know, do we have more of an apples to apples comparison, and then do we get more alignment or divergence in terms of our outputs. So for this particular study, which I'm going to show you some results in just a minute, The data collection here was retrospective. It was from a 2011 to 2018. There are a couple of challenges here. One is, you all probably know that the nature of first-line care with the introduction of PD-L1 therapy has changed pretty quickly. And then obviously, if you're looking at something like overall survival, long-term follow-up is key to be able to doing that assessment. And if your last data collection is 2018, that doesn't give you a whole lot of time for doing long-term follow-up. So the results that we're going to look at in a minute are stratified according to 3 treatment types. So patients who got either doublet chemotherapy, patients who got PD-L1 monotherapy, or patients who got PD-L1 plus doublet chemotherapy. These are in progress results, but it gives you an idea of some of the work that's happening right now to understand real world evidence endpoints a little better. So what I'm showing you are 2 graphs from the research that was published last year. The link is available online. So in the graph on the left, and I apologize if these are not super sharp, but what we're looking at is patients age 75 or older at index as a function of one of those 3 different therapy types I mentioned. Now, each colored dot here corresponds to a different data partner. And you can see that the percentage age 75 or older at index, it does vary quite a bit. And we don't know exactly why that is. There needs to be a little bit more investigation here, but it shows you that there are some differences either in the populations between data partners, which is not surprising, or just other ways in which some of the data is getting captured. So on the right side, again, each of these different color lines corresponds to results from a different data partner. And what we see is the Kaplan-Meier curve for real-world overall survival based on the type of therapy. So whether it was the platinum doublet chemotherapy, the PD-L1 monotherapy, and the PD-L1 plus doublet chemotherapy. And again, what you see is that there is some divergence in these real-world overall survival curves. And we don't know exactly why that is right now. There is still, I think, more work that Friends is going to be doing to better elucidate, what are the differences either in how things are defined in these endpoints or how some of the analyses are undertaken that may give rise to these. And the point I do want to drive home is not so much that the difference here is a problem, but rather we just want to better understand how we're using real-world data, how we're using the analytics in a way that we can get to robust results going forward. Finally, a few FDA takeaways from recent meetings that I want to mention. These highlight many of the themes I've touched on throughout my talk. So FDA's perspective on randomization is that the chief concern is the believability of the result. That sounds quite simple, of course. There's a lot that goes into it, but blinding and randomization are important parts of that believability. So randomization is key. It balances for things that are unknown, and FDA still requires adequate and well-controlled studies, even though you can certainly submit real-world evidence to FDA. And that blinding and randomization are important aspects of having an adequate and well-controlled study. So the next point is about historical controls, and I used historical controls here. Some people use external controls. Like any new area, you see a range in the different terminology that people use often for the same concept. So what FDA has said that these should be reserved for special circumstances. And again, we get to the issue of bias, that it may not be possible to control for bias and external controls, and they should be used in very limited circumstances. Real-world evidence endpoints. Subjective endpoints are a concern, and this is something that the real-world evidence framework also touches on. And in the framework, they do mention that they prefer to have more objective endpoints for real-world evidence studies. And part of this is because subjective endpoints have a motivating quality. So if you're doing a walk test, that can be influenced by wanting to perform very well on the day that you're doing that test, and those effects are transient, can change over time. And generalizability. So there's this been, you often hear at real world evidence meetings that RCTs, are not generalizable, that it's such a select population that those findings don't necessarily extend to real world evidence. And that's a reason to do real world evidence studies, is because you'll get results that are more generalizable. And what FDA has said is that the idea that traditional trials are not generalizable or don't give you the right answer, that's wrong. And the reason, the biggest issue that you might see differences between real world evidence and RCTs goes to the real world evidence adherence problem, which I've mentioned already. So I will conclude there. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you today. Feel free to follow up with me offline if you have questions.